The scent I will always associate with grief is lemon polish and old paper. It was the smell of my grandfather's study, a room that had always been a sanctuary, a place of quiet wisdom and worn leather armchairs. But now, it was a tomb. The air, usually warm with the scent of his pipe tobacco and the faint, sweet aroma of peppermint candies he kept in a crystal dish on his desk, was cold and still. A thin layer of dust was beginning to settle on the mahogany surfaces, a silent testament to the fact that he was truly gone. He had been gone for 2 weeks, exactly 14 days, and the house still held its breath, waiting for him to walk through the door, his booming laugh echoing off the high ceilings. My grandmother, Margaret, sat in a wingback chair by the unlit fireplace, her small frame swallowed by the rich, burgundy velvet. Her hands, usually busy with knitting or tending to her roses, were knotted together in her lap, the skin over her knuckles as thin and pale as parchment. She stared at the cold, dark hearth as if she could will a fire into existence through sheer force of will. My mother, Susan, stood by the tall window, her back to us, her silhouette a rigid line against the gray, overcast sky. Rain was threatening, the clouds heavy and bruised-looking. She was twisting the gold locket at her throat, a nervous habit from childhood. It was the locket Grandpa Arthur had given her for her 16th birthday. Inside, a tiny, smiling photo of him was nestled against one of her as a gap-toothed girl. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a behemoth of dark wood and brass that Arthur had inherited from his own father, ticked with an oppressive, metronomic slowness. Each tick was a hammer blow, counting out the seconds of our new, emptier reality. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Abernathy, sat behind Grandpa's massive desk, his face a mask of professional sympathy. He was a man made of straight lines and muted colors, gray suit, silver hair, a thin, unsmiling mouth. He cleared his throat, and the sound was like gravel scraping against stone, startling in the thick silence. "If we're all ready," he began, his voice dry and rustling like old documents. He adjusted a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles on his nose and looked down at the thick sheaf of papers before him. The last will and testament of Arthur Pendleton. The final words of the man who had been the sun in our family's solar system. I moved from the doorway and settled on the ottoman near my grandmother's feet, resting a hand on her knee. The wool of her skirt was soft and familiar, but her leg was trembling almost imperceptibly. I gave it a gentle squeeze, and she turned her head, offering me a watery, fleeting smile that didn't reach her tired, red-rimmed eyes. "I, Arthur James Pendleton," Mr. Abernathy began to read, his voice a droning monotone that seemed entirely unfit for the gravity of the words, "being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils." He went on through the usual legal jargon, the formal, stilted language that felt so alien, so unlike the warm, vibrant man we had lost. I let the words wash over me, my mind drifting to the last time I'd seen him, just 3 weeks ago. He had been in his garden, his large hands, usually so strong, looking frail as he pointed out the new rose bushes he'd planted for Margaret. His voice had been weaker, a little reedy, but his eyes, the same deep blue as my mother's, had still twinkled when he'd snuck me a chocolate from the stash he kept hidden from my grandmother. Our little secret, he'd whispered with a wink, the familiar scent of peppermint on his breath. How many secrets had we shared? Hundreds, I thought. Silly, wonderful little secrets that had bound us together. My attention snapped back to the room when Mr. Abernathy paused. The shift in cadence was subtle, but it was there. A slight hesitation before he continued. "To my beloved wife, Margaret Pendleton," he read, and I felt my grandmother's hand cover mine, her fingers cold. "I bequeath the sum of $500,000, as well as lifetime rights to our marital home at 12 Oak Lane, with all its contents, for her comfort and security." A collective, silent exhale. It was what we expected. Generous, but expected. "To my only daughter, Susan Miller," he continued, and my mother turned from the window, her face pale, her eyes wide and expectant. "I bequeath the family's summer cottage on Lake Huron, as well as the sum of $500,000. My mother let out a small, choked sob and pressed her fingers to her lips. The lake house was her favorite place on earth, a repository of sun-drenched childhood memories. It was a perfect, thoughtful gift from a loving father. To my granddaughter, Clara Miller, Mr. Abernathy's eyes flickered toward me over his spectacles. My heart gave a little thump. I bequeath my collection of first-edition classic novels and the sum of $500,000 to be used for her future, with the hope that she continues to follow her dreams, wherever they may lead. Tears pricked my eyes. The books. He knew how much I loved them, how I would spend hours in this very study, carefully turning their fragile, yellowed pages, breathing in their history. It was so perfectly him. Loving. Considerate. The best man I had ever known. Mr. Abernathy paused again, and this time the silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable. He took a sip of water from a glass on the desk, the sound of his swallowing unnaturally loud. He seemed to be steeling himself. And now, he said, his voice dropping slightly, we come to the remainder of the estate. This includes Pendleton Manufacturing, Incorporated, all associated properties, the entirety of my stock portfolio, and all residual cash assets, totaling an estimated value of $42 million. A gasp escaped my mother's lips. We knew Grandpa was successful, that his manufacturing business had thrived, but we had never known the sheer scale of it. He was a man who drove a 10-year-old Buick and wore sweaters with patched elbows. 42 million. The number felt unreal, like something from a movie. According to Mr. Pendleton's explicit and legally binding instructions, Mr. Abernathy continued, looking at none of us, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere on the leather-bound book spines behind my head. The remainder of the estate, in its entirety, is to be divided equally, in 2 shares. My mother took a step forward. 2 shares? What does that mean, David? Between who? Susan and Clara? Mr. Abernathy shook his head slowly, his expression grim. He looked, for the first time, deeply uncomfortable. No, Susan. Not between you and Clara. He took a deep breath, the paper in his hand trembling slightly. The first share is to be placed in a trust for his family residing at 12 Oak Lane. That is you, Margaret, and you, Susan, and you, Clara. My grandmother frowned, a look of deep confusion clouding her features. The first share? David, I don't understand. Who gets the second share? Mr. Abernathy met her gaze, his own filled with a mixture of pity and resolve. He cleared his throat one last time, and the words he spoke next fell into the silent room and shattered everything. The second equal share, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, is to be placed in a trust for his other family. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a ringing, deafening void where sound used to be. The grandfather clock seemed to have stopped ticking. My own heartbeat thudded in my ears, a frantic, panicked drum. Other family? The words didn't make sense. It was like he had started speaking a foreign language. My grandfather didn't have another family. We were his family. The only one. My mother was the first to break. A laugh, sharp and hysterical, tore from her throat. What? David, that's not funny. Is this some kind of sick joke? Did Dad put some sort of bizarre clause in here to keep us on our toes? I assure you, Susan, this is no joke, Mr. Abernathy said softly. Arthur was very clear. Every detail has been meticulously, legally documented for over 30 years. 30 years. The number hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. 30 years he had been living this lie. My mother's face crumpled, her disbelief dissolving into raw, wounded confusion. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, that's impossible. Who are they? Mr. Abernathy looked down at the will, though I knew he didn't need to. The names were surely burned into his memory. The beneficiaries of the second trust are listed as Eleanor Vance, and her son, Thomas Vance, and Thomas's son, Leo Vance. Eleanor. Thomas. Leo. The names were strange, foreign objects in the familiar space of my grandfather's study. They meant nothing to us. Yet, they were about to mean everything. My grandmother made a small, wounded sound in the back of her throat. Her hand, which had been resting on mine, gripped me with surprising strength, her nails digging into my skin. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a dawning horror that was terrifying to behold. It wasn't just shock on her face, it was a flicker of something else. Something that looked unnervingly like recognition. "Did you know?" My mother's voice was a raw, accusing whisper, directed at our grandmother. "Did you know about this?" Margaret shook her head, but the movement was slow, dazed. "No. I never." The name Eleanor. I heard him say it once, in his sleep, years ago. He told me it was no one. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The dam of our grief, so carefully constructed over the past 2 weeks, had just been obliterated. This was a new kind of pain. A sharp, ugly, twisting betrayal that poisoned every good memory, every loving glance, every shared secret. My grandfather, the man who taught me how to ride a bike and how to find constellations in the night sky, the man who smelled of peppermint and safety, was a stranger. A liar. He had built our lives on a foundation of deceit, and the entire structure was now collapsing around us. Just then, a sound from the hallway intruded on our private hell. The heavy chime of the doorbell. It rang once, twice, a polite but insistent sound that sliced through the tension in the room. Mr. Abernathy looked toward the door, his expression unreadable. He glanced at his watch. "That would be them," he said, his voice quiet. "I was instructed to have them arrive at 3 o'clock. My mother stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You invited them? Here? To my father's house?" "To Arthur's house, Susan," the lawyer corrected gently but firmly. "And according to his will, it is now their house, too. As are all his other assets. They have a right to be here." The doorbell chimed again, longer this time, more demanding. The sound was an assault, a violation of our grief, of our home. No one moved. We were frozen, 3 generations of women, shipwrecked in the ruins of our own family history, and the architects of our destruction were standing right on our doorstep. The lemon polish in the air suddenly smelled bitter, the old paper like the scent of decay. The sanctuary had become a cage, and we were trapped inside with the ghosts of a life we never truly knew. The housekeeper, Maria, who had been with my grandparents for as long as I could remember, finally answered the insistent chime of the doorbell. Her footsteps were slow and hesitant on the marble floor of the foyer, as if she sensed the intrusion of something unwelcome. We heard the heavy oak door swing open with a low groan, a sound that seemed to signal the invasion of our lives. A murmur of voices followed, one a low, polite male tone, the other female, smoother, more confident. I couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was all wrong. These were not the familiar voices of friends or neighbors offering condolences. These were the voices of strangers. My mother, Susan, stood rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if holding herself together. My grandmother, Margaret, had lifted her head from her hands, her face blotchy and tear-streaked, her eyes fixed on the doorway to the study with a look of terrified anticipation. I remained on the ottoman, my hand still resting on her knee, a useless, trembling anchor in a churning sea. Then, they appeared in the doorway, framed by the dark wood-like figures in a somber portrait. Mr. Abernathy stood up, a gesture of formal welcome that felt like a profound betrayal. "Please, come in," he said. There were 3 of them. The first was a woman who must have been Eleanor Vance. She was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit, her silver hair cut in a sharp, elegant bob. She carried an air of cool composure, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. She was beautiful, in a severe, classic way, with high cheekbones and intelligent, watchful eyes. Her scent preceded her into the room, a subtle but expensive perfume, something with notes of gardenia that felt jarringly out of place amidst the familiar smells of our home. She looked around the study, her gaze sweeping over the bookshelves, the fireplace, and finally, us. There was no apology in her eyes, no shame. Only a quiet, unwavering assessment. Beside her stood a man who had to be her son, Thomas. He was in his 50s, the same age as my mother, and the resemblance to my grandfather was immediate and shocking. It was in the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes, the way his dark hair, threaded with gray, curled slightly at the temples. Seeing him was like looking at a ghost, a younger, harder version of Arthur Pendleton. He wore a well-tailored navy blazer and a look of stern discomfort. His eyes met my mother's, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of something. Was it pity? Recognition? I couldn't be sure. And then there was the third person, a young man who looked to be my age, maybe a year or two older. He had the same dark hair as Thomas, but his was thicker, unruly. He was tall and lean, dressed more casually in dark jeans and a gray cashmere sweater. This had to be Leo. His face was a thundercloud of resentment. His eyes, a startlingly light shade of hazel, were narrowed, sweeping over the three of us with open hostility. He looked at the room not with the detached curiosity of his grandmother or the strained politeness of his father, but with a raw, possessive anger, as if we were squatters on his rightful land. The silence in the room was suffocating. It was a physical pressure, pressing in on my ears, making my lungs feel tight. It was a battle of wills, a standoff between two families who shared a history neither knew existed until this very moment. Mr. Abernathy, ever the professional, broke the spell. "Margaret, Susan, Clara," he said, gesturing to us. "This is Eleanor Vance, her son, Thomas Vance, and her grandson, Leo Vance." He then turned to them. "Eleanor, Thomas, Leo, this is Margaret Pendleton, her daughter, Susan Miller, and her granddaughter, Clara Miller." The introductions fell into the void, met with stony silence. Eleanor Vance gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in my grandmother's direction. It was not a gesture of respect, but a simple acknowledgement of her presence, like noting a piece of furniture in the room. My mother finally found her voice, and it was laced with venom. "Get out," she said, her voice low and trembling with rage. "Get out of my father's house." Thomas Vance's jaw tightened. "According to the will, Mr. Abernathy just read to us, it's our father's house, too." He said the word father with a strange emphasis, a mixture of bitterness and claim. "He was not your father," my mother shot back, taking a step forward. "He was my father. He was her husband." She pointed a shaking finger at my grandmother. "You are nothing. You are a mistake. A dirty little secret he kept in a closet." The air crackled with hostility. Leo took a protective step in front of his father and grandmother. "You don't get to talk to them like that," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "You have no idea who he was. You lived in a comfortable little fantasy while our family got the scraps. The secret phone calls, the holidays he always had to work, the whispered conversations. We were the secret, yeah, but maybe you were the lie." His words hit me harder than a physical blow. A comfortable little fantasy. Was that what my life had been? My entire childhood, all those perfect Christmases and summer vacations, were they all just part of an elaborate performance? I looked at my grandmother, who seemed to have shrunk into her chair, her face a mess of bewildered pain. I looked at my mother, whose righteous anger was beginning to crumble into heartbroken confusion. Eleanor Vance finally spoke, her voice calm and measured, cutting through the emotional chaos. "There is no need for this kind of display. We are not here to fight. We are here to claim what is rightfully ours, as stipulated in Arthur's will." "Rightfully yours," my mother scoffed, her voice rising in pitch. "You have no rights here. You were his mistress. A homewrecker." Eleanor's cool composure finally cracked. A faint flush rose on her high cheekbones. "I was his first love," she said, her voice tight with decades of repressed emotion. "He was going to marry me. Before his father forced him to marry her," she tilted her head toward my grandmother, "for a business merger. For money. He came back to me a year later. He never truly left." The revelation hung in the air, another bomb detonating in the wreckage of the room. I stared at my grandmother, Margaret. A marriage for a business merger? Was that possible? Her story had always been so romantic. They'd met at a university dance, fallen in love at first sight. Had that been a lie, too? My grandmother wouldn't meet my gaze. She just kept staring at the cold fireplace, as if lost in a memory from a lifetime ago. Mr. Abernathy stepped forward, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. This is not the time or the place to litigate the past. The will is clear. The estate is to be divided. That is a legal fact. How we move forward from here requires cooperation. Cooperation? Leo laughed, a short, bitter sound. You think we're going to cooperate with them? They've been living the high life on our grandfather's money for 50 years while we got the leftovers. It's time for a correction. The leftovers? I spoke for the first time, my voice sounding thin and reedy to my own ears. I stood up from the ottoman, my legs feeling unsteady. My grandfather loved us. He was here, every day. He wasn't some part-time visitor. He built this family. He built this life. You were the sideline. The hobby. Leo's hazel eyes flashed, and he took a step toward me. He was taller than I was, and he seemed to loom over me, his anger a palpable heat. He loved you with his money. He gave you this big, fancy house and a name. He gave us himself. The parts of him he couldn't share with you. The parts that weren't for sale. The injustice of his words stole my breath. This man, this stranger, was trying to claim ownership of my grandfather's heart, delegitimizing my own family's place in it. He was trying to reframe our entire existence as a transaction. The assets will need to be appraised, Thomas said, his voice practical, pulling the conversation back from the brink of pure emotion. He was speaking to Mr. Abernathy, pointedly ignoring my mother. Pendleton Manufacturing, the properties, the contents of this house. We need a full accounting. The contents of this house, my mother repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. You are not touching a single thing in this house. These are our memories. Our lives. They're also assets, Mrs. Miller, Eleanor said coolly. And they are half ours. The paintings, the furniture, the silver. Arthur was very specific. Everything is to be divided. The thought was monstrous. Strangers coming into our home, putting price tags on my grandmother's wedding china, on the worn armchair where Grandpa read me stories, on the very fabric of our lives. It was a desecration. We will need access to the house, Thomas continued, pressing his advantage. And to all of the financial records for the business. Absolutely not, my mother stated flatly. It's not a request, Leo interjected, his gaze locked with mine. It's a legal right. Mr. Abernathy, am I correct? The lawyer nodded grimly. You are. Both families have equal legal standing in all matters concerning the estate. The room felt like it was closing in on me. The air was thick with the scent of Eleanor's gardenia perfume, my grandfather's lemon polish, and the damp, earthy smell of the impending rain. It was a nauseating combination. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall had resumed, each tick a reminder that time was moving forward, dragging us into this nightmare, whether we were ready or not. This wasn't just about money. It was a battle for history, for memory, for the very definition of family. They weren't just claiming a fortune, they were trying to steal our past. And as I looked at Leo's defiant, angry face, I knew he felt the exact same way. We were two sides of the same counterfeit coin, each believing we were the genuine article. The war had just begun, and it was going to be fought right here, in the heart of our home, room by room, memory by memory. The days that followed the reading of the will bled into one another in a gray, disorienting haze. The Vance family, as they were now starkly known, did not move in, but their presence was a constant, suffocating weight. They had, through Mr. Abernathy, arranged for a team of estate appraisers to begin the grotesque work of cataloging and valuing every object in the house. Our home, once a sanctuary of warmth and memory, was transformed into a museum of our own lives, with strangers in white gloves touching, measuring, and photographing everything we held dear. The sound of their work became the new soundtrack to our grief. The low murmur of their voices in distant rooms, the soft click of a camera shutter, the rustle of their clipboards. I would walk into the living room and find a small, numbered sticker affixed to the leg of the piano my grandmother taught me to play. I'd see another on the base of the porcelain lamp my mother had made in a pottery class. Each sticker was a tiny violation, a brand marking our memories as chattel. My mother reacted with a furious, brittle energy. She followed the appraisers from room to room, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed, her silence more intimidating than any shouting. She was a hawk guarding a ravaged nest. She couldn't stop them, but she was determined to bear witness to every desecration. She barely ate, fueled by coffee and a simmering rage that left dark circles under her eyes. My grandmother, Margaret, retreated. She spent most of her time in her bedroom, the door closed. The few times I saw her, she looked smaller, frilier, as if she were physically fading. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice was a thin, papery whisper. The revelation of Arthur's long-term betrayal, coupled with Eleanor's claim of a forced marriage, seemed to have shattered the very foundation of her identity. She was no longer the cherished wife, the matriarch of the Pendleton family. She was a woman who had unknowingly lived a 50-year lie. The shame and hurt radiated from her in waves, so palpable it was hard to breathe around her. I found myself caught in the middle, trying to be a buffer for my mother's rage and a comfort to my grandmother's despair. But I was drowning myself. My own grief for my grandfather was hopelessly tangled with a profound and bitter anger. How could the man who taught me about honesty and integrity have been capable of such a monumental deception? Every cherished memory was now suspect, tainted by the knowledge of what he was hiding. When he was at my high school graduation, beaming with pride, was he thinking of Leo's? When he was teaching me to drive, had he already taught Thomas? The house itself felt different. The air was heavy with unspoken words and the cloying scent of the appraiser's cleaning fluids, which failed to mask the lingering aroma of Eleanor Vance's gardenia perfume from that first day. It felt as if her ghost, and the ghosts of her son and grandson, now walked these halls alongside ours. One afternoon, about a week into this new, unbearable reality, I was in my grandfather's study. The appraisers were working upstairs, their footsteps a muffled thump on the ceiling above. I was supposed to be sorting through his personal papers, a task Mr. Abernathy said was necessary to ensure there were no other financial documents or hidden assets. In truth, I was hiding. The study, once a place of comfort, now felt like the epicenter of the lie. I ran my fingers over the spines of his first edition books, my inheritance. It felt like blood money. I was sitting at his desk, staring blankly at a stack of old bank statements, when the door creaked open. I expected it to be my mother, bringing me a cup of tea I didn't want, but it was him. Leo. My heart leaped into my throat, a frantic, startled bird. I hadn't seen any of them since that first, awful day. He stood in the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his dark jeans, his expression just as hostile as I remembered. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. "My father and I have a meeting with Abernathy about the business assets," he said, his voice a low rumble. I was early. I wanted to see this room. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. The sound of the latch clicking shut felt unnervingly final. He walked around the room slowly, not touching anything, but taking it all in with those intense hazel eyes. He stopped in front of the fireplace, looking up at the portrait of my grandparents that hung above the mantel. It was from their 25th wedding anniversary. They were both smiling, Arthur's arm wrapped securely around Margaret's shoulders. "It's a good painting," he said, his tone flat. "He looks happy." He was happy, I said, my voice tight. This was his home. We were his family. He turned from the portrait to face me, a humorless smirk twisting his lips. "You keep saying that." "We were his family." "Like it's a fact you have to keep repeating, or you'll stop believing it yourself." "I don't have to convince myself of anything," I retorted, standing up from the desk chair. "I lived it. You're the one who has to invent a history for yourself." He took a few steps closer, closing the distance between us until he was standing on the other side of the massive mahogany desk. The scent of rain and cold air clung to his jacket. I don't have to invent a thing. I have 30 years of memories. Maybe they weren't in a mansion, but they were real. Did you know he coached my little league team? For 3 years. The Trojans. We won the championship in my last year. He was the third base coach. The image was so specific, so jarringly domestic, that it threw me off balance. I tried to picture my grandfather, my Arthur, in a baseball cap and a windbreaker, yelling encouragement from a dusty third baseline. I couldn't. It didn't fit with the man I knew, the man who preferred golf and quiet afternoons reading in this study. I bet you didn't even know he liked baseball, Leo continued, seeing the confusion on my face. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk, his gaze pinning me. What else didn't you know? Did you know he hated coconut? That he was terrified of thunderstorms? That he could recite half of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner from memory because my grandmother made him learn it when they were young? My mouth was dry. I didn't know any of those things. He had always put coconut cream pie on his plate at Thanksgiving, even if he only took a single bite. He had always comforted me during thunderstorms, his presence a calm, solid fortress against the noise. The poem. I had never heard him mention it. Each detail Leo shared was a small, sharp cut, bleeding the color from my own memories. He was building a ship in a bottle for my 10th birthday. Leo's voice was softer now, a current of genuine pain running beneath the anger. It was a huge, complicated one. A clipper ship. He worked on it for months in his workshop out back. The night before my birthday, he got a call. It was your grandmother. She'd had a fall. He left in the middle of the night. He never finished the ship. He looked away then, his eyes focusing on the model galleon on my grandfather's bookshelf. It was a beautiful, intricate thing, one I'd always admired. He gave you that one instead, didn't he? Leo asked, his voice thick with a bitterness so old it was almost part of him. He just gave you the one he had already finished. I couldn't speak. I felt a wave of nausea. I remembered that ship. He'd given it to me for my 12th birthday. He'd told me he built it just for me. Another lie. A casual, thoughtless lie that had meant the world to a little girl, and had meant betrayal to a little boy across town. Why are you doing this? I finally managed to whisper, my throat tight. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to understand, he said, his eyes finding mine again, hard and unflinching. You think you lost a perfect grandfather. You didn't. You lost a man you never even knew. My family, we knew exactly who he was. We knew we only got a piece of him, and we loved that piece with everything we had. You all had the whole man, and you didn't even see him. He pushed himself away from the desk and turned to leave. His hand was on the doorknob when I found my voice again. My grandmother is falling apart, I said, and the words were raw with a pain that surprised me. Whatever you think you're owed, whatever anger you have, just know that you are destroying an 80-year-old woman who has lost the love of her life. Leo paused, his back still to me. For a long moment, he didn't move. The only sound was the incessant ticking of the clock in the hall. Then, he spoke, his voice so low I could barely hear him. My grandmother is a 2-time cancer survivor. He held her hand through every single chemotherapy treatment. He read to her for hours when she was too sick to get out of bed. She's loved him for 60 years, and she had to share him with you. Don't talk to me about a woman's pain. He opened the door and was gone, leaving me alone in the sudden, ringing silence of the study. The room felt colder than ever, filled with the ghosts of 2 different lives. The air was thick with the scent of his rain-soaked jacket, mingling with the lemon polish and old paper. I sank back into the leather chair, the fight draining out of me, replaced by a deep, aching emptiness. He was right. I didn't know my grandfather. And I was beginning to realize that in this war over his fortune, the real battle was over the truth of who he was. It was a truth I was no longer sure I wanted to find. The meeting with Mr. Abernathy must not have gone well. An hour after Leo left the study, my mother stormed into the house, her face a thunderous mask of fury. She had been at the grocery store, a mundane errand that seemed absurd in our new reality. She slammed a paper bag onto the kitchen counter with such force that a carton of eggs inside audibly cracked. "They want to sell the company," she announced, her voice shaking with rage. "Thomas and that boy. They want to liquidate Pendleton Manufacturing, the company my father built from the ground up." I had followed her into the kitchen, a bright, cheerful room of yellow walls and copper pots that now felt like a stage set for a tragedy. The smell of brewing coffee, usually a comfort, was sharp and acrid. "Sell it? Why? It's a successful business." "Because it's too complicated to manage jointly," she spat, mimicking a voice I assumed was Thomas Vance's. "Because it's easier to realize the capital. They don't care about the legacy. They don't care about the hundreds of people who work there, people Dad knew by name. They just want the cash. It's a smash and grab." She began yanking groceries out of the bag, her movements jerky and violent. A jar of pickles slipped from her grasp and shattered on the tile floor, splattering the cabinets with brine and glass. For a moment, she just stared at the mess, her shoulders heaving. Then a ragged sob broke from her, and she slid down the cabinets to sit on the floor, burying her face in her hands amidst the wreckage. I rushed to her side, carefully avoiding the broken glass, and put my arms around her. She felt fragile, like a bird with a broken wing. Her anger was just a shell, and it had finally cracked, revealing the raw, bottomless grief beneath. "He loved that company, Clara," she wept into my shoulder. "It was his life's work. He started it in our garage. I used to watch him, his hands covered in grease, his face so determined. He built it for us. For his family. And now these vultures are going to tear it apart and sell it for scrap." I held her, murmuring useless words of comfort, my own heart aching with a fresh wave of despair. This was a new front in the war. It wasn't just about the house and the memories anymore. It was about my grandfather's legacy, the public-facing part of his life that had always seemed so solid and untouchable. Later that evening, I decided to do something I had been avoiding. I went up to the attic. It was a place of organized chaos, filled with steamer trunks and labeled boxes, a repository of our family's history. The air was thick with the dry, dusty scent of time itself. A single, bare bulb cast long, dancing shadows, making the dressmaker's mannequins in the corner look like silent, watchful sentinels. The floorboards creaked under my feet, a familiar, complaining sound. I was looking for something, anything, that might give me a clue, a piece of leverage, a glimpse into the part of my grandfather's life he had kept so perfectly hidden. He was a meticulous man. It seemed impossible that he could have maintained a second life for over 30 years without leaving a single trace. I started with a large, leather-bound trunk marked Arthur's Papers. It was filled with old report cards, university diplomas, and business awards. I sifted through the documents, my fingers growing grimy with dust. It was a portrait of a successful, conventional life. The life we all thought he'd lived. There was nothing. I moved on to old photo albums, the pages stuck together with age. I saw my mother as a baby, my grandparents on their honeymoon in Niagara Falls, me on my first bicycle. It was our story, written in smiling, sun-faded photographs. There were no strange faces, no unexplained trips. Hours passed. The attic grew colder as the sun went down, the weak light from the single bulb feeling increasingly inadequate against the encroaching darkness. I was about to give up, my body sore from sitting on the hard wooden floor, when I noticed it. An old, beaten-up metal footlocker, tucked away in a dark corner behind a stack of my old school projects. Unlike everything else in the meticulously organized attic, it was unlabeled. My heart began to pound a little faster. It was locked with a small, rusty padlock. I rummaged through a nearby toolbox and found a hammer and a sturdy screwdriver. With a few sharp, metallic cracks that echoed loudly in the silent attic, the lock broke. I lifted the heavy lid. The air that rose from the locker was stale, smelling of cedar and secrets. The contents were covered with a folded, yellowed newspaper dated 1968. I carefully lifted it out. Beneath it lay a world I never knew existed. The first thing I saw was a stack of photographs, tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were not in an album. They were loose, candid. I untied the ribbon, my hands trembling. The top photo was of a young woman with a radiant smile and dark, intelligent eyes. It was Eleanor Vance, but she looked so different. Softer. Happier. She was sitting on a picnic blanket, a book in her lap. The next photo made my breath catch in my throat. It was my grandfather, Arthur, looking impossibly young, probably not much older than I was now. He was lying on the same picnic blanket, his head in Eleanor's lap, looking up at her with an expression of such pure, unguarded adoration that it hurt to look at. This was not the respectable, buttoned-up patriarch I knew. This was a young man deeply, wildly in love. I flipped through the rest. Arthur and Eleanor dancing in what looked like a roadside tavern. Arthur and Eleanor on a beach, squinting in the sun, their arms around each other. One photo showed them standing in front of a small, nondescript house, a sold sign planted in the lawn. They were holding hands, and Arthur was holding up a single key, a look of triumph on his face. Beneath the photos was a thick bundle of letters, tied with twine. The handwriting on the top envelope was his, bold and familiar. The letters were addressed to my Ellie. My hands felt cold and numb as I opened the first one. It was dated a year before he married my grandmother, Margaret. My dearest Ellie, it began. I cannot wait to see you tomorrow. Every minute away from you feels like a year. I've enclosed a sketch of the house I saw today. I think you'll love it. It has a garden for you, and a workshop for me. I know it's small, but it will be ours. A place to start our forever. All my love, always, Art. I read on, my heart sinking lower with each word. The letters were filled with passion, with plans, with a future that had never happened. They talked about the children they would have, the places they would travel. It was the love story of Arthur and Eleanor. Then the tone of the letters changed. There was a desperate, frantic edge to his writing. He wrote of his father's disapproval, of pressure, of threats to his inheritance and the future of the family business if he didn't marry Margaret Sterling, the daughter of his father's business partner. He is forcing my hand, Ellie, one letter read. He calls you a distraction, a girl with no name and no prospects. He doesn't understand that you are my whole world. He says it is my duty to the family. He is giving me no choice. But I swear to you, this changes nothing between us. It is a piece of paper, a business arrangement. My heart will always, only, be yours. It was all there, in his own handwriting. A confirmation of everything Eleanor had said. My grandmother was a business arrangement. The foundation of our family was not love, but a contract. At the very bottom of the locker, I found one more thing. A small, velvet-covered box. I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded satin, was a simple gold locket. It was not ornate, but it was clearly old and cherished. I carefully pried it open. On one side was a tiny, sepia-toned photograph of the young, smiling Eleanor. On the other side, inscribed in delicate, looping script, were 3 words, Art loves Ellie. I closed the locker, my body feeling heavy, as if the weight of the secrets inside had settled onto my own shoulders. The attic no longer felt like a part of my home. It felt like a crime scene, and I had just uncovered the evidence of the original sin. My grandfather hadn't just had an affair. He hadn't just cheated on my grandmother. In his own heart, according to these letters, his life with us was the betrayal. His life with Eleanor was the truth. I didn't know what to do. Show these to my mother? It would destroy her, obliterating the last vestiges of her idealized image of her father. Show them to my grandmother? The cruelty of it would be unbearable. Use them as leverage against the Vances? How? By proving their claim was more legitimate than our own? I sat there for a long time in the cold, dusty darkness, the velvet box clutched in my hand. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to travel up through the floorboards, a slow, relentless heartbeat counting down to a confrontation I had no idea how to navigate. The discovery hadn't armed me. It had disarmed me completely, leaving me with a truth that was more painful and complicated than I could ever have imagined. Armed with the devastating secrets from the attic footlocker, I felt a shift inside me. The initial shock and grief had begun to curdle into a cold, hard resolve. My family was being torn apart, not just by the Van Cest claims, but by the weight of my grandfather's lies. If we were going to survive this, we couldn't be passive victims. We had to fight back. And the first battleground was the company. The next morning, I found my mother in the kitchen, staring into a cold cup of coffee, the same defeated slump in her shoulders from the day before. The smell of stale coffee and my mother's quiet despair filled the room. "I'm going to the office," I announced, my voice firmer than I felt. She looked up, her eyes dull. "What for, honey?" "There's nothing we can do." "Yes, there is," I said, pulling on my coat. "Grandpa didn't just leave behind a will. He left behind a business, a paper trail. I'm going to go through every file, every ledger, every contract for the last 40 years if I have to. Thomas and Leo want to sell because they think it's just a number on a page. I'm going to learn this business inside and out. We're not letting them bulldoze us." A tiny flicker of light returned to her eyes. "You don't know anything about manufacturing, Clara." "Then I'll learn," I said. "Grandpa built it from nothing. It's in our blood, right?" Pendleton Manufacturing was located in an industrial park on the edge of town. It wasn't a sleek, modern facility, but a sprawling complex of older brick buildings, humming with the constant, low thrum of machinery. The air outside smelled of hot metal and lubricating oil, a scent I vaguely associated with the few times Grandpa had brought me here as a child. Walking through the front doors felt like stepping into a time capsule. The lobby was paneled in dark wood, with worn linoleum floors and faded photographs on the walls showing the company's evolution. The receptionist, a woman with a mountain of curly gray hair named Marge, had been there for over 30 years. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw me. "Clara. Honey, what are you doing here? I was so sorry to hear about your grandfather." Her voice was warm and full of genuine sympathy. "Thank you, Marge. I'm here to get some papers from his office." Of course. Just go on up. It's just how he left it." Grandpa's office was on the second floor, overlooking the main factory floor through a large plate glass window. It was a simple, functional space, a stark contrast to the comfortable luxury of his study at home. It had a large metal desk, overflowing file cabinets, and a massive corkboard on the wall covered in blueprints, order forms, and photos of his employees' families. This was where Arthur the businessman had lived. I spent the entire day there, and the day after that. I started with the current financials, trying to make sense of profit and loss statements, supply chain logistics, and client portfolios. The language was foreign, but I was determined. I found old employee files and read the personal notes my grandfather had written in them, reminders of birthdays, anniversaries, children's names. He hadn't just been a boss, he had been a part of their lives. On the third day, while I was deep in a file drawer labeled Archived Contracts, Thomas and Leo Vance walked in. I hadn't heard them approach over the din of the factory. Thomas stopped short in the doorway, a flicker of surprise on his face. Leo, however, looked instantly suspicious, his eyes narrowing as he took in the file spread across the desk. "What are you doing here?" Leo demanded, his tone accusatory. "I could ask you the same thing," I replied coolly, not looking up from the file in my hands. "Last I checked, my name is on the company letterhead, too. Or at least, it will be." "We're here to meet with the CFO," Thomas said, his voice measured and calm, a stark contrast to his son's overt hostility. He walked into the room, looking around with a strange expression. It was the same look of detached curiosity he'd had in the study, but here, it was mixed with something else. A flicker of longing? I've never been in this office before, he murmured, almost to himself. He didn't want you here, Leo spat, directing the comment at me. He kept his world separate. You being here is a violation of that. My grandfather's talent for keeping worlds separate is the reason we're all in this mess, I shot back, finally looking up and meeting his glare. I'm done respecting his arrangements. They were built on lies. Thomas ignored our exchange. He walked over to the large window and looked down at the factory floor. Men and women in work clothes moved with practiced efficiency amidst the loud, clanking machinery, sparks flying from a welding torch in the distance. The air was hazy with dust and smelled of industry. He told me about the first machine he ever bought, Thomas said, his voice quiet, his reflection a faint ghost in the glass. A second-hand lathe. He saved for 2 years to buy it. He set it up in the garage of the house on Oak Lane. He said the noise drove Margaret crazy. He smiled, a faint, sad twisting of his lips. He was so proud of it. The story was another small, sharp shock. He had shared that with them. That piece of his history, the very origin story of his life's work, belonged to them, too. That's why you can't sell it, I said, my voice softer now, sensing a potential crack in his armor. This place isn't just an asset. It's his story. It's the story of all those people down there. It's a business, Leo cut in, his voice hard. And from the preliminary numbers we've seen, it's underperforming. It's carrying too much overhead, the equipment is outdated. It needs a massive capital infusion to be competitive, and frankly, it's not worth the investment. Selling is the smartest financial decision. It's not just a financial decision. I insisted, standing up. It's about people's lives. Oh, here we go, Leo scoffed, rolling his eyes. The bleeding heart routine. You know what's about people's lives? My mother working 2 jobs for 10 years to put me through college because my grandfather's stipend wasn't enough. My father having to start his own business from scratch because he wasn't allowed to be a part of this one. Don't lecture me about what's fair. My father wanted to be an architect, Thomas said, still looking out the window, his voice distant. He was good, too. He got into a great program. But Arthur, he wouldn't help pay for it. He said it was too risky, that there was no future in it. He wanted him to be a businessman. Like him. So he studied business. But he never got to work here. Arthur said it would raise questions. The quiet tragedy of his words silenced the room. Another life, another dream, sacrificed on the altar of my grandfather's secrets. He hadn't just denied his other family a place in his home, he had actively shaped and limited their lives to maintain his deception. So you're selling his company out of spite? I asked Thomas, my voice barely a whisper. He finally turned from the window, and his eyes, so much like my grandfather's, were filled with a deep, ancient weariness. I'm not selling it out of spite, Clara. I'm selling it because it's the only way to get free. My entire life has been lived in the shadow of this place, this man. I've been the son he could never acknowledge. My son has been the grandson he could only see on weekends. We deserve a clean break. We deserve our own future, built with our own money, not tied to his ghost. His confession, so full of raw honesty and pain, left me with no reply. I understood, in that moment, that for them, this fortune wasn't a windfall. It was a form of reparations. It was the payout for a lifetime of being second best, of being hidden. The door opened, and a man in a suit, the CFO, poked his head in. Thomas? We're ready for you. Thomas gave me a final, long look. Think about it, Clara. Is holding on to this, he gestured around the office, worth continuing the damage he did to all of us? He and the CFO left, but Leo lingered in the doorway. He looked at me, at the files on the desk, his expression unreadable. The anger seemed to have drained out of him, replaced by a similar weariness I'd seen in his father. He loved this place, Leo said quietly. My dad's right, it was a shadow over us, but, my grandfather, he talked about it all the time. He knew every employee's name. He cared about them. I think. I think he would hate that we're selling it. Then why are you doing it? I asked. He looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see an antagonist. I saw a grandson, just as lost and confused as I was. Because what my dad said is true. We need to be free of him. Maybe this is the only way. He left, closing the door behind him, and I was alone again in the office, the hum of the factory floor a constant, vibrating presence. The smell of hot metal filled my lungs. I looked from the window down at the workers, then back at the messy desk, at the story of a lifetime's work told in paper and ink. Thomas and Leo weren't wrong. But my mother wasn't wrong either. My grandfather had created a problem with no clean solution, a knot so tangled that pulling on any one thread only seemed to tighten the others. And I was standing right in the center of it. The battle for the company became the new focus of our lives. My days were spent at the factory, immersed in the world of Pendleton manufacturing. I learned about supply chains, union contracts, and the delicate art of client relations. I met with foremen who had worked there for 40 years, men with hands like leather and a fierce loyalty to the man they still called Mr. P. They told me stories about my grandfather, how he'd co-signed a mortgage for one of them, paid for another's son's medical bills, how he knew the names of all their children. This was the man I remembered, the kind, generous soul. It was a stark contrast to the deceitful manipulator from the letters in the attic. He contained multitudes, and I was beginning to understand that both versions of him were true. My mother, seeing my determination, began to emerge from her fog of grief. She started coming to the office with me. Having worked as my father's bookkeeper for years, she had a natural aptitude for numbers. She dove into the company's financials, her sharp mind finding discrepancies, questioning expenses, and identifying inefficiencies that Leo had mistaken for underperformance. She discovered the company wasn't failing, it was just old-fashioned, a little bloated, perhaps, but its foundations were solid. A fire had been lit in her. This was something she could control, a tangible way to defend her father's legacy. Meanwhile, the war at home continued. The appraisal process was finally complete, and Mr. Abernathy presented both families with a thick, 3-volume binder detailing every single item in the house on Oak Lane, from the grand piano in the living room valued at $12,000 to the sterling silver salt and pepper shakers valued at $75. The next step, he explained grimly, was the division. We met in the formal dining room, a room reserved for holidays and special occasions. The long, polished mahogany table felt like a battlefield. My mother, my grandmother, and I sat on one side. Eleanor, Thomas, and Leo sat on the other. The air was thick with tension, smelling of the lemon oil Maria had used to polish the table and the faint, ever-present scent of Eleanor's gardenia perfume. Mr. Abernathy proposed a system. They would go through the list, item by item. Each family would have the chance to claim an item. If both wanted it, its value would be deducted from the share of the family who took it. It was a cold, transactional way to divide a life. It started with the big-ticket items. The paintings, the antique furniture. Thomas and Eleanor were surprisingly detached, claiming a few landscape paintings and a Persian rug, their choices seemingly based on monetary value rather than sentiment. My mother, on the other hand, fought for everything that held a memory. The grandfather clock, Mr. Abernathy announced. Valued at $8,000. We'll take it, my mother said instantly. Thomas nodded. Fine. The dining room table and chairs. Valued at $15,000. Ours, my mother snapped. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. We would also like the dining set. My mother's head whipped around to face her. Absolutely not. We had every Thanksgiving, every Christmas dinner at this table. Arthur and I had dinner at this table as well, Eleanor said calmly. On the nights Margaret was visiting her sister. He told me he bought it because it reminded him of one in his grandmother's house. The casual way she dropped this intimate detail, this stolen memory, was like a physical blow. My mother's face went white. My grandmother, who had been silent until now, made a small, pained sound. Take it, my mother choked out, her voice thick with disgust. I don't want it anymore. And so it went. A brutal process of emotional archaeology, with each item exhuming a new ghost, a fresh betrayal. The Vances knew things about our home, about our lives, that they had no right to know. Arthur had shared it all with them. He had brought them into this house, our sanctuary, and given them pieces of it. We weren't just dividing assets, we were discovering the depth of our own ignorance. We got to the section marked jewelry, specifically, Margaret's. My grandmother had a small but beautiful collection, gifts from Arthur over 50 years. The diamond and sapphire necklace, Mr. Abernathy read. Valued at $22,000. It was the necklace Arthur had given her for their 40th anniversary. She wore it to every formal event. Obviously, that stays with my mother, Susan said, her voice firm. Eleanor was silent for a moment, her cool gaze resting on my grandmother. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. I would like the necklace. My mother gasped. You can't be serious. That was an anniversary gift. He bought it in New York, Eleanor said, her eyes still on Margaret. In 1994. He told me he was on a business trip. He called me from the hotel room and described it to me. He said the sapphires reminded him of my eyes when I was young. She paused, letting the cruel words hang in the air. He said he wished he could give it to me, but that he had to give it to her. For appearances. My grandmother, Margaret, who had been a silent, grieving ghost through this entire process, finally broke. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the wood floor. She stood up, her small frame trembling, not with frailty, but with a sudden, surging rage. Her eyes, usually so soft and clouded, were blazing. She looked directly at Eleanor, and for the first time, she fought back. You think you know him, she said, her voice low and shaking, but carrying across the table with stunning force. You think you have this grand, tragic love story. You have a collection of stolen moments. Stolen weekends. Stolen trinkets. I had his life. I had the day-to-day. I had the man who was sick with the flu, the man who was terrified when our daughter had pneumonia, the man who cried when his own father died. I held his hand through 50 years of life, not just on clandestine little holidays. She took a shaky breath, her gaze never leaving Eleanor's. You can have the necklace. You can have all of it. Because all you'll ever have are things. I had the man. The real, complicated, difficult, wonderful man. You have his ghost. And you're welcome to it. With that, she turned and walked out of the dining room, her back straight, her head held high. The silence she left in her wake was profound. Eleanor Vance, for the first time since I'd met her, looked shaken. A crack had appeared in her perfect, composed facade. Thomas looked down at the table, a muscle working in his jaw. Even Leo seemed taken aback, his usual scowl replaced by a look of stunned confusion. My mother and I just stared at the empty doorway where my grandmother had been. In that moment, she had reclaimed her own history, her own marriage. She had reframed it not as a lie, but as a reality that was simply more complex than any of us had known. She had lived it, and she had survived it. The meeting fell apart after that. Mr. Abernathy shuffled his papers, flustered. Thomas quietly suggested they postpone the rest of the division. No one disagreed. Later that evening, I found my grandmother in the garden, her sanctuary. The sun was setting, casting long, golden fingers of light across the lawn. The air smelled of damp earth and the sweet, spicy scent of her prize-winning roses. She was pruning a bush, her movements sure and steady, her face calm in the fading light. I stood beside her for a moment in silence. I'm proud of you, Grandma, I said softly. She snipped a dead bloom from a stem and looked at me, a small, genuine smile on her lips. I'm proud of me, too. It's been a long time since I felt like Margaret Sterling Pendleton. For weeks, I've just been his widow. His fool. She turned back to her roses. You know, your grandfather wasn't a bad man, Clara. He was a weak one. He was trapped by his own father's expectations, and then he was trapped by his own choices. He spent his whole life trying to make everyone happy, and in the end, he just made a terrible mess. She looked at the house, its windows glowing warmly in the twilight. This was our home. Our life was real. Her life was real, too. That's the part that's so hard to understand. Both things can be true at once. Her simple, profound words settled in my heart. She was right. This wasn't a story with a hero and a villain. It was a tragedy with a cast of wounded characters, all of us trying to make sense of the mess one man had left behind. What do we do now? I asked. She pointed with her shears to a particularly stubborn weed growing at the base of the rosebush. We do what I'm doing now, she said. We find the parts that are choking the life out of everything, and we pull them out, one by one. It's slow, hard work. But it's the only way anything can grow again. I looked at the house, at the garden, at my grandmother's strong, determined face, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. The war wasn't over. But for the first time, I felt like we might just survive it. My grandmother's stand in the dining room marked a turning point. It wasn't that the hostility vanished, but its character changed. The raw, open warfare subsided into a kind of tense, guarded diplomacy. Her act of defiance had redrawn the lines, reminding everyone that our family's history, our 50 years of life with Arthur, could not be dismissed or devalued. It had weight. It was real. A few days later, a strange and unexpected opportunity for a truce presented itself. Mr. Abernathy called with a problem. A major client of Pendleton Manufacturing, a company that accounted for nearly 30% of its annual revenue, was threatening to pull their contract. The company was being bought out by a larger corporation, and the new CEO was notorious for cleaning house and bringing in his own suppliers. The loss of the contract would be catastrophic, making the sale of Pendleton not just a strategic choice, but a financial necessity. The new CEO is a man named Richard Davies, Mr. Abernathy explained over the phone, his voice tight with worry. He's refusing to meet with our people. He says he's not interested in doing business with a small, family-run company in the midst of an estate dispute. It's a mess. After he hung up, I sat in Grandpa's office at the factory, the scent of stale coffee and anxiety thick in the air. This was it. This could be the blow that sank the whole ship. I was looking through the client file for Davies's company, my mind racing, when I saw a note my grandfather had scribbled in the margin years ago. Richard Davies. Son, Leo. Same age as my Leo. Loves baseball. My heart skipped a beat. A long shot. A ridiculous, improbable long shot. But it was the only shot we had. I found Leo in the company's small, dusty archive room, sifting through old blueprints. He was there more and more often, a silent, brooding presence. I noticed he wasn't just looking at numbers anymore, he was studying the designs, the history, the actual work of the company. I need your help, I said, without preamble. He looked up, surprised. His default expression around me was still a mixture of suspicion and resentment. My help? With what? The Davies contract, I said. I think I have a way to get a meeting, but I can't do it without you. I explained my grandfather's note, the connection between the names. It's a crazy idea, but what if you know him? Did you play baseball against a kid named Leo Davies? He stared at me for a long moment, his hazel eyes searching my face. Then he slowly shook his head. No. I don't remember a Leo Davies. But, he trailed off, a thoughtful frown on his face. The name Richard Davies sounds familiar. My grandfather mentioned him once. He said he was a tough negotiator but a fair man. He looked at me, a flicker of something new in his expression. Cooperation. What's your plan? My plan was audacious. We couldn't get a corporate meeting, so we would bypass the boardroom entirely. The next day, Leo and I drove 2 hours to the suburban town where Richard Davies lived. We weren't dressed for a business meeting. We were in jeans and sweaters. We found the local Little League field, a well-kept diamond of green grass and red-brown dirt, smelling of freshly cut grass and summer nostalgia. It was a Saturday, and a game was in full swing. We saw him almost immediately. A man in his late 50s, standing behind the backstop, yelling encouragement to the team at bat. He matched the photos from the company file. Richard Davies. "This is insane," Leo muttered beside me as we approached. "He's going to have us arrested for stalking." "Just follow my lead," I whispered back. We stood next to him, pretending to watch the game. The crack of the bat, the shouts of the kids, the encouraging murmurs from the parents, it was a slice of pure Americana. "Great day for a game," I said to him, my voice casual. He grunted in agreement, not taking his eyes off the field. "My grandson's the pitcher. Kid's got a decent arm." We watched in silence for another minute. Then, I played my card. "This reminds me of when I was a kid," I said, my voice tinged with nostalgia. "My grandpa used to bring me to games like this. He loved baseball." Davies glanced at me, a flicker of interest. "Oh yeah? Who's your grandpa?" "Arthur Pendleton," I said. His head snapped around. He stared at me, then at Leo, his eyes narrowing. "Pendleton? From the manufacturing company? I heard he passed. I'm sorry for your loss. He was a good man." "Thank you," I said. "I'm his granddaughter, Clara. And this," I gestured to Leo. "This is his grandson, Leo." Davies' eyebrows shot up in confusion. He looked from my face to Leo's, a clear question in his eyes. "It's a long story," Leo said, his voice dry. Apparently, Davies replied, his tone shifting, becoming more cautious, more businesslike. "Your office has been trying to get on my calendar all week. This is a pretty unconventional approach, kids." "We know," I said. "But we also know you're about to pull a contract that will gut his company. The company he spent his life building. We couldn't let that happen without at least talking to you, man to man. Or, you know, man to man and woman." He studied us for a long time, his gaze shrewd. The shouts from the baseball game seemed to fade into the background. "Your grandfather was a straight shooter," he said finally. "He never tried to pull a fast one on me. He drove a hard bargain, but his word was his bond. And his product was always top-notch." "It still is," Leo said, stepping forward. His voice was steady, confident. "The company has good bones. It's got a skilled workforce and a loyal client base. It's been neglected, maybe, but it's not broken. Selling it off for parts would be a mistake." I stared at him. He sounded like he believed it. He was defending the company. Our company. Davies crossed his arms, considering. "The estate dispute is messy." "I don't like messy." "We're working on it," I said. "Look, we're not asking you to sign anything today. We're just asking for a chance. Give us 90 days. 3 months. Let us show you what we can do, together. Let us prove that Arthur Pendleton's company is still worth believing in." There was a loud crack of the bat, and everyone cheered. Davies' grandson had just hit a double. A proud smile touched Davies' lips. He watched his grandson pull up to second base, then he turned back to us. "Your grandfather once told me the most important thing he ever built wasn't his company," he said, his voice softer. "It was his family. Looks like he built 2 of them." He looked from me to Leo and back again. "You've got guts. Both of you. Reminds me of him." He sighed, a long, drawn-out sound. "All right. You've got your 90 days. Don't make me regret this." The drive back was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. The tension between us had eased, replaced by a shared sense of accomplishment. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windshield, warming my face. The car smelled of the leather seats and the faint, dusty scent of the baseball field that clung to our clothes. "You were good back there," I said, breaking the silence. "You sounded like you've been working there for years." He shrugged, his eyes on the road. I've been reading the old files. The production reports, the schematics. He was brilliant. The way he solved engineering problems was elegant. He was talking about our grandfather. And for the first time, he used the word he with a tone of reverence, not resentment. So you don't want to sell anymore? I asked, my voice cautious. He was quiet for a long time, watching the highway hypnosis of white lines spooling out before us. I don't know, he said finally, and it was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. My dad, he just wants to be free. I get that. But when I'm in that place, I feel connected to him. To my grandfather. In a way I never was when he was alive. He glanced at me. Does that make sense? Yeah, I said, my voice a little thick. It makes perfect sense. We hadn't solved everything. The house was still a battleground. The two families were still a world apart. But for the first time, Leo and I weren't enemies. We were two grandchildren, trying to navigate the complicated legacy of a man we both loved, and were both just beginning to understand. We had saved his company, together. And in doing so, maybe, just maybe, we had taken the first step toward saving ourselves.